Have you ever felt like your effort was like a scream into the void, even when you did everything perfectly? Have you ever carried a burden so heavy that even your faith began to tremble in your hands? I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm 75 years old, and for a long time, I hid a secret that consumed me inside. It wasn't in the outside world that I experienced my greatest pain. It was inside the church, where they said a wise woman builds her house, even when betrayed, even when humiliated, even when cast aside, as if my worth were tied to my marital status or my ability to keep smiling with a broken heart. For decades, I was seen as an example, the faithful wife, the Christian mother, the sister who served, who interceded, who never raised her voice. But behind the image so zealously constructed, there was a woman bleeding in silence. I was betrayed, abandoned, judged, and worst of all, silenced. Because the pain of a Christian woman in a broken marriage is still seen as a lack of faith, as spiritual weakness. How many times have I heard, "Hang in there, God will restore." But no one saw that. While they waited for the marriage to be restored, my soul was being destroyed. Does this situation sound familiar to you? Maybe you're going through something similar. Maybe you know someone who's silently fighting this battle, afraid of being labeled, excluded, or worse, discredited. The truth is, many of us were taught to endure in the name of God, when in reality, what He wanted was to free us. Don't leave now. The best is yet to come. Because today, after years of silence, I've decided to tell it all, unfiltered, unafraid. My story could be yours, and what you're about to hear next could transform the way you view faith, marriage, and, most importantly, the value of a Christian woman who chooses to live in truth. So, if you're ready to hear what almost no one has the courage to say out loud, take a deep breath, because what's coming next will move you. I was the wife many held up as an example, discreet, faithful, dedicated, present in everything. During 30 years of marriage, I built a home based on what I was taught was God's will: submission, constant prayer, and silence in the face of difficulties. I had 3 children, all raised with fear and reverence, teaching each of them what I myself believed with all my strength, that a Christian woman is the foundation of the family. And because I believed this so fervently, I became exactly what they expected of me. I never questioned it. I never went beyond what I was told was a wife's place. I was always there, at Sunday services, at prayer meetings, in the kitchen at church events. I never let anything go unnoticed at home. Not food, not affection, not prayer. My husband? A respected man, involved in ministries, well regarded by all. I saw him as my priesthood. He led Bible studies, prayed aloud for us, and was praised for taking such good care of the family. And I proudly believed that our life was a living testament to a union built on solid rock. But behind the scenes, another reality existed. I began to notice different gestures, more frequent absences, gazes lost in space. And yet, I blamed myself for thinking something was wrong. Because in the mindset I was taught, the wise woman doesn't suspect. She prays. She doesn't confront. She fasts. She doesn't back down. She holds firm. I became a prisoner of an image, a prisoner of an ideal that was slowly suffocating me. While the world outside was changing, inside my house, everything had to stay the same. I was praised for being that woman who never caused trouble. But the hidden truth was that, behind the appearance of perfection, there was a soul slowly fading. I didn't feel seen or heard, only expected. They expected my strength, my firmness, my constancy. But no one wanted to know how I really was. And it was precisely at that point, in that tense silence, that I began to question everything. Because something inside me screamed, albeit softly, that this could not be the fullness of a Christian marriage. That God did not create me to be an obedient shadow of someone who no longer saw me. And yet I remained there, insisting with all my might. Because abandoning Him would, for me, be synonymous with failure, with disappointing God. And this fear, the fear of disappointing heaven, is what keeps so many women trapped in realities that were never holy, only disguised as holiness. Get ready. What comes next will delve into the most hidden layers of this topic. It was a typical Tuesday, the kind where everything seems normal on the outside, but inside, something is already restless. He had left for a meeting, left his phone on the table, something he never did. The screen lit up, vibrating with a notification, and there, in seconds, everything changed. I wasn't looking for it. I never looked. But that message appeared before my eyes as if God were saying, "It's time to see." It was from a younger woman. The words? Sweet, intimate, careful. They were phrases he hadn't said to me in years. "I missed you today. I still taste your kiss." My heart froze. The ground didn't disappear. It simply ceased to exist beneath my feet. In that moment, I entered another dimension of my own story. It was as if, for years, I had lived a carefully scripted storyline, and now someone had pressed pause and revealed the behind the scenes. Behind the scenes full of lies, omissions, and appearances. He arrived home that night as if nothing had happened, and I stood there, staring at a man who had suddenly become a stranger. But do you know what hurt most? It wasn't the kiss on another mouth, nor the words exchanged in secret. It was the fact that for so long, I had prayed for him to see me, and he had chosen only to see someone else. Betrayal has the power to change everything, but not just because of the act itself. What breaks a woman inside is the shock to her own perception of worth. It's the loss of trust, not just in the other person, but in her own intuition, in her own surrender. Because you start to wonder, how did I not notice? Where did I go wrong? What was I missing? And in this spiral of thoughts, guilt begins to seep in like poison. And that's when the mindset taught for so many years reveals itself as a prison. Because everything inside me said, leave. But everything I learned screamed, stay, fight, pray more, be wise. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He didn't cry. He simply said, "You're a good woman, but I need to be happy." As if his happiness were more valuable than my dignity. As if I were merely a functional part of his life, useful, correct, predictable. The impact of those words pierced me like a sentence. I wasn't betrayed just as a wife. I was betrayed as a whole woman, as someone who always believed in the sacredness of the covenant. I expected tears, or at the very least, an awkward silence, a guilty look, a plea for a second chance. But what I received was coldness, measured words, spoken as if they were part of a normal conversation. "You're a good woman, but I need to be happy." Those were his exact words, and what hurt me about them wasn't just their content, but the calm with which he delivered them, as if he were asking for more coffee, not undoing a 3-decade-old alliance, as if his happiness were an unquestionable argument, and my pain were merely an inevitable side effect of no real importance. I stood there, motionless. It was as if time had stopped. Or maybe it was my mind trying to process the new reality, like someone waking from a dream and not recognizing their own room. He spoke of freedom, of rediscovering oneself, of a new phase in life, all with elegant, rational, almost spiritual vocabulary. "I don't want to hurt you, Maggie. I just want to live my truth." That was how he justified the betrayal, as an act of personal courage. And I, in that moment, realized how much so many truths can be distorted when they serve one's own desires. No one prepares a Christian woman for this kind of discourse. We learn about repentance, about reconciliation, about carrying the cross. But no one teaches us what to do when the other simply turns their back and walks away with a light smile as if ridding themselves of a burden. That shook my entire emotional and spiritual structure, because until then, I believed that effort, prayer, zeal, all of that built a shield against chaos. But the hidden truth presented itself stark and clear. Loving deeply doesn't always prevent someone from leaving, and being faithful isn't always enough to be chosen. He moved on with his life. He continued attending church, smiling in family photos, being praised for his maturity in dealing with the separation. As for me, I slowly sank into a kind of nameless grief. Because when the other person feels no remorse, the pain seems even more lonely. It was as if I were overreacting, being dramatic, too fragile. I tried to convince myself I was strong, that it was just a phase, a trial. But inside, my soul screamed, and no one heard. This kind of impact is difficult to describe, because it's not just the end of a marriage. It's the shattering of an identity, of a history, of everything you believed you'd built based on what's right. And suddenly, it all crumbles silently, like a wall crumbling from within. You see the rubble, but no one else seems to notice. And that, perhaps, is what hurts the most. The invisible, the silent abandonment, the contempt that comes disguised as honesty. And the most painful thing is that, even after everything, I continued trying to understand where I'd lost myself. I mentally reviewed every detail, every conversation, every ignored silence. I spent days and nights reliving moments when he might already have been distant, even though he was there. And this wore me down inside, as if I were trying to piece together a puzzle whose pieces had been ripped from my history. His lack of remorse not only hurt me, it disoriented me, because, as contradictory as it may seem, sometimes we expect an emotional reaction, a lament, an "I'm sorry," and when even that doesn't come, it feels like the pain is left unattended, with no place to fit. So, if this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated most with you, sharing your experience, your perspective, or even a feeling that arose while listening. To me, can be more powerful than it seems. First, because you're not alone, and second, because these stories need to be told, felt, and embraced. Every comment here helps keep this conversation alive, helps other women realize they're not exaggerating, that their pain has a name and a place. This is a real way to transform wounds into bridges, and every time a woman hears herself in another's story, something begins to change. I've kept this story to myself for a long time, and maybe you've been keeping yours to yourself too. You don't need to write it all down, nor expose what's not ready yet. But if a word touched you, if a phrase made you breathe differently, write it down. Because sometimes, just by naming a feeling, we begin to heal. And believe me, you'll be surprised by the strength that can emerge from the simple act of not keeping quiet. I had hoped that, even in the face of such devastation, the church, my community, my refuge for so many years, would be a welcoming place. I imagined someone would hear me, that hands would be extended, that there would be shared tears, wise counsel, genuine embraces. But what I found was silence, an uncomfortable, dense silence that said everything without words. The looks that had once been respectful now scrutinized me as if I were the problem, as if, somehow, his betrayal reflected some failure of mine. They asked me, in almost docile tones, if I had prayed enough, if I was fasting for restoration, if I hadn't left spiritual gaps at home. It was like being stabbed again, only this time, from hands supposedly carrying the cross of Christ. There, amidst wooden pews and worship music, I began to perceive a hidden truth I never imagined I'd face: judgment disguised as pity. A woman who is betrayed within a Christian environment often has to deal not only with the pain of abandonment, but also with the burden of proving herself spiritually worthy of compassion. Because if a husband cheats, the almost automatic question is, what did she stop doing? Did she stop taking good care of him? Did she stop being submissive? Did she lose her sweetness? And then, everything you've lived, everything you've built, boils down to the implicit conclusion that you failed. You become, in a veiled way, the cause of your own suffering. And when pain encounters this kind of structure, the impact is even more profound, because you begin to believe, you begin to rethink your every move, to distrust your own history, to blame yourself for not having avoided the inevitable. It was at this point that something inside me began to break. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of a faith that had been built on blind obedience. The journey of deconstruction that began there was not an easy one. And I'm not talking about faith in God, that curiously remained intact, but about faith in the system, in the unspoken rules, in the standards imposed on women in the name of holiness. I began to see how so many of us were educated in silence, taught to smile while bleeding, to endure while drying up inside, to build with our own tears what others insist on destroying. Because the virtuous woman, according to that distorted view, is one who endures everything without complaint. But there's something even more essential here, something few realize. This pressure for wisdom, the wisdom that builds, supports, and saves, often becomes a tool of manipulation. The idea that a woman must always do more, pray more, serve more, even when she's already broken, becomes a trap where spirituality is confused with self-denial. And it was at that moment, in that dark valley of the soul, that I began to see my own story through new eyes, as if the pain opened a crack to an internal transformation I never imagined I'd experience. And there, amidst the judgment, the incomprehension, and the silence, a new question began to emerge within me. It was in this mix of pain and judgment that a verse began to echo in my mind with an almost cruel force. A wise woman builds her house. I had heard this line hundreds of times, maybe more. But now, in this scenario where everything I had built lay in ruins, it sounded like a sentence, as if, somehow, I had failed to be that woman. As if the collapse of my marriage were proof that I lacked wisdom, patience, or sufficient faith. And the worst part, this wasn't just coming from outside, it was starting to come from within. It's at this point that the spiritual weight becomes almost unbearable. Because when you believe that everything in life is a result of your sowing, your faith, or your obedience, every tragedy seems to have a hand in it. So you don't just suffer, you blame yourself for suffering. And this cycle is devastating. I often found myself trying to decipher exactly where I had gone wrong. Was I too critical? Was I loving too little? Did God see me as insufficient? These questions mingled with demands disguised as advice. You need to fight for your home. Forgive 70 times 7. Be like Esther, wise like Abigail, persevering like Hannah. But no one asked how my heart was. No one asked how I felt sleeping alone every night, carrying the weight of being the woman who stayed, and who now had to rebuild, alone, what he destroyed. As if the fidelity of a marriage depended solely on the spiritual structure of a wife. As if I were wise enough, none of this would have happened. And I believed it for a while. I believed it with all my might. I woke up every day trying to be better. I prayed heartbreakingly. I fasted, hoping for a miracle. I read Proverbs as if they were survival manuals. But the more I gave of myself, the more I nullified myself. That's when I began to realize something that frightened me, but also freed me. Biblical wisdom has never been synonymous with silent suffering. A wise woman isn't one who ignores emotional abuse in the name of peace. She is firm, discerning, courageous. She builds, yes, but not at the cost of her own destruction. And this verse, so often used as a warning, began to take on new meaning for me. Because building a home isn't the same as single-handedly sustaining a crumbling castle. Building a home is, above all, knowing where to plant, with whom to build, and when it's time to leave the stones lying fallow. This turning point changed everything. My faith, my identity, my perspective on marriage, and most importantly, my perspective on myself. I came to understand that there is wisdom in staying, but there is also wisdom, a lot of it, in leaving, in stopping carrying guilt that isn't yours, in realizing that love isn't proven by how much you endure, but by how much you respect yourself within the relationship. This understanding was one of the greatest revelations of my journey, because I no longer needed to hide behind a misinterpreted verse. I no longer needed to fight for something that, in truth, had long since left me. This silent guilt, often masked as pity, has a name. It's the spiritual distortion that distances women from their own truth. And it's at this point, when you begin to see things more clearly, that a profound question arises, one that forces you to stop, take a deep breath, and face your own soul. This question pierced me like an arrow. What was I trying to protect, and why? The truth is, for a long time, what terrified me most wasn't the pain of a broken marriage. It was the label, the title, the invisible seal that hangs over anyone who decides to leave. The divorcee. 3 words that within many religious circles are spoken with a tone that mixes pity, judgment, and sometimes a hint of veiled mockery, as if there were something wrong with having chosen to stay alive, as if that made me less worthy of being there, of being heard, of serving, of dreaming again. I remember getting ready for church with a pang of anguish in my chest. The pretty dress, the neat hair, the Bible in my bag, on the boo. Outside, everything seemed in place, but inside, I carried a guilt that wasn't mine, trying to hide an identity I didn't choose. I avoided certain gazes. I felt the weight of hushed whispers. And worst of all, I began to grow silent. I, who had always been active, involved, full of ideas, I withdrew, because inside me, a voice kept repeating, "Now you're the woman who couldn't hold on to the marriage, the one who couldn't handle it, the one who let go," even though she'd been betrayed, even though she'd done everything she could, even though she'd fought until the end. This mentality is silent and destructive, and the scariest thing is that often it doesn't need to be said out loud because it's already ingrained in the culture, between the lines of sermons, in the glances that avoid, in the invitations that stop coming, in the ministries that close their doors with other criteria. And so, without anyone saying it openly, the divorced woman becomes almost an uncomfortable presence, one that many prefer not to see. But why? Because she's a living reminder that stories don't always end like fairy tales. And that bothers. It shatters the fantasy. But there's something here that needs to be said. Breaking a destructive cycle isn't failure. It's courage. The real downfall is staying where your soul is dying. And this fear of being the divorcee, which I carried for so long, was actually a reflection of the collective fear of facing reality. The reality that not every relationship can be restored. That forgiveness isn't synonymous with coexistence. And that dignity isn't negotiable. And do you know what's even crueler? This same structure that silences divorced women idolizes the image of a woman who endures everything in the name of faith, as if spirituality were measured by the ability to withstand the unbearable. And this has nothing to do with the gospel that heals, liberates, and restores. This kind of expectation, this standard disguised as virtue, only fuels masks and sickens souls, because there's nothing lonelier than being surrounded by people and still feeling like you can't be who you truly are. And that's when, little by little, I began to peel back those layers, to look at myself with more compassion, to give myself the right to exist without apology. I wasn't a walking mistake. I was a woman rebuilding. And being divorced stopped being a shameful title and became just a part of my story, not my destiny. Because what defines who I am isn't what people said about me. It's what God knows about me. And He knows what's behind the scenes. He saw the hidden tears, the sleepless nights, the whys no one heard. He knows the hidden truth no one wanted to see, the fear of being rejected socially, spiritually, emotionally, often paralyzes more than the pain of divorce itself. And it is at this point that a much deeper battle begins, that of rebuilding one's identity after it has been shattered. It's strange how we learn to do this, without even realizing it, smiling automatically, raising our hands in praise even when everything inside us is falling apart. I was there, in the front pew, my voice in tune, my constant presence, and completely absent from myself. I sang about grace, about freedom, about a God who heals, and at the same time, I smothered an open wound that no one seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, but it was more convenient to pretend they didn't see it. Because that's what many of us do when we feel broken. We become excellent actresses. We disguise pain with spirituality, camouflage shame with service. Ministry becomes a mask. Involvement becomes a shield. And without realizing it, we begin to exist only in the background of our own lives, always trying to prove that we're still useful, that we still have value, that we deserve to stay there, even while carrying a silent mark that made us believe we were less than. Deep down, what I wanted was for someone to say, "I see you," not just the strong, dedicated, committed woman, but also the tired, insecure woman trying to hold it all together. But almost no one did, because within certain structures, being vulnerable is dangerous. It's risky. It's opening the door to judgment, to empty advice, to that kind of look that seems compassionate but is filled with disguised correction. And so, to avoid this discomfort, we learn to hide, to be silent, to distance ourselves from our own pain in the name of misinterpreted obedience. I came to believe that my suffering was a kind of disguised punishment, that I should endure it in silence to show that I trusted God. And this is so cruel because it suffocates the soul. It makes us forget that mourning is also prayer, that even Jesus wept, and that denying pain is not faith, it's denial. And denial has a high price. It robs us of our authenticity. We cease to be whole to fit into the expectations of others. And this exhausts. It drains. It erases. At times I felt like a beautiful house on the outside, but full of invisible cracks. Everything seemed in place, but any strong wind would tear me apart on the inside, and no one saw it. Or maybe they saw it, but didn't know how to deal with it. Because for many, it's easier to applaud the resilient woman than to embrace the woman in ruins. Except that ignoring this truth has a profound impact. Hidden pain accumulates. And when the soul languishes in silence, spirituality becomes performance. Faith becomes obligation. And praise loses its meaning. Behind the silence, behind the forced smile, lies a desperate search for validation, as if, by continuing to serve, we could make up for what we've lost, as if performance were the price of acceptance. And it is at this point that one of the greatest distortions of this journey begins, when we begin to believe that our worth before God depends on our usefulness. And it was there, in that circle without pomp, without a pulpit, without a microphone, just simple chairs, weary hearts, and eyes that shifted away from one another with a certain shame, that something inside me awakened. I was about to leave, as I always did. I participated, smiled, listened, but avoided getting truly involved, until a sister, with a soft voice, began to tell her story. It wasn't dramatic, nor full of ready-made phrases. It was raw, it was real, and perhaps that's why it was so powerful. The way she opened her own wound without shame disarmed me. Each of her words pierced me, as if pieces of my own journey were being revealed there, only with a different voice. She didn't speak in a rehearsed way. She didn't use verses to disguise her feelings. She was simply honest. She said that one day she'd grown tired of pretending, tired of hiding her tears in the car after church, tired of sacrificing herself in the name of an image that was never hers. And as she spoke, an uncomfortable truth formed within me. I was losing myself, trying to appear strong. I was sacrificing my identity in the name of a faith that never asked me to. And there, for the first time in a long time, I cried. But not the kind of pent-up crying, hidden behind the folded handkerchief in my lap. It was a free, vulnerable cry, with a taste of freedom and fear at the same time. Because it's scary to allow yourself to feel after so long protecting yourself. But it's also liberating. And it was in that moment that I understood. What kept me trapped wasn't the divorce, nor people's judgment, nor even the pain of abandonment. It was the idea that I needed to remain silent to continue being loved. That woman's words sparked an internal transformation, not because she gave me answers, but because she gave me permission to feel, to question, to acknowledge my fragility without feeling weak. Because there's a huge difference between vulnerability and weakness, and I never realized it. The hidden truth, which almost no one tells us, is that there's strength in exposing yourself. There's power in not knowing all the answers. There's healing in saying, I'm struggling too, because authenticity has an impact that perfection never can. After that day, my mind began to shift, not overnight, but like someone slowly waking up after a long sleep. I was still afraid. I still felt guilty for everything I'd experienced. I still carried scars, internal noises, voices from the past trying to keep me grounded. But something inside me had turned the key. And that's how many changes begin. Not with bold decisions, but with small revelations, with glimpses of truth, with encounters that take us out of automatic mode. And I remember that, at the end of that meeting, I stared at that woman as if she'd performed magic. But it wasn't magic. It was courage. It was presence. This was someone who decided to stop hiding the secrets of her own soul. And this kind of truth has a ripple effect. When a woman rises, others rise with her. Not because she has all the answers, but because she becomes a mirror. And suddenly, we realize we're not alone. That she's not the only one afraid. That she's not the only one trying to find her own name after being called so many other things. That moment was a silent but definitive turning point. Because from that moment on, I began to see signs that there was life beyond performance, that there was a possible journey after the fall, and above all, that God wasn't turning away from my pain. It was I, ashamed, hiding from him, leaving, was never part of my plan. I dreamed of building, of lasting, of overcoming challenges like someone holding God's hand and moving forward. But at that point in the journey, I was no longer walking, I was crawling inside. The truth is, my soul had long since departed. What remained was just my body, taking up space in a house that no longer welcomed me, in a marriage that, day after day, dimmed the light in my eyes. I wondered if it was faith to continue, or fear of change, and it was only when I began to face this question head-on that I understood how much I was betraying myself. Deciding to leave wasn't an explosion. It was a series of small internal clicks. A look that hurt, a word that wounded me, a prayer I prayed alone, and I felt God respond with silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of someone who watches lovingly as you finally awaken. Because sometimes God doesn't shout. He waits. He waits for us to tire of going in circles, of justifying the unjustifiable, of calling across what is actually a prison. He waits for us to stop using verses to hide our fears. And when that reality sinks in, change stops being an abyss and begins to feel like a path. Narrow, yes, but full of meaning. That week, I left. There was no movie scene, no suitcases thrown into the car with a dramatic soundtrack. There was silence. There was a note written with trembling hands. There was fear, a lot, but there was also faith. Faith that I wasn't being crazy, rebellious, or ungrateful. Faith that God hadn't called me to die in a marriage that had become an emotional prison. Faith that starting over wasn't about failing. It was about obeying an inner calling I'd been stifling for years. The kind of faith that doesn't scream, "I won," but whispers, "I chose to live." It was a decision no one understood right away, and that's okay. It took me a while to understand too, because those who look from the outside see the facade. They see the ring on your finger, the photo, on social media, the amen on Sunday. But you don't see behind the scenes. You don't see the weight we carry in silence, the tears swallowed in the shower, the nights when the pillow is more honest than any advice. People wanted explanations. But how do you explain the decision to leave a place where your soul no longer breathes? How do you explain that loving yourself sometimes requires distance? How do you explain that God's peace does not dwell in environments of emotional violence, even when those environments are cloaked in religion? I left with little, a suitcase, a low bank account, a head full of doubts. But inside me, there was something new, hope. Not the naive hope of someone who thinks everything will be easy, but the mature hope of someone who understands that chaos is also part of the process, that the initial mess is part of the transformation, that rebuilding requires demolition, and that certain losses, however painful, are deliverances in disguise. This decision didn't make me better than anyone else. It didn't make me superior, but it made me whole. It put me back on the path to my truth. And it gave me the courage to face the sidelong glances, the veiled judgments, and the doubts that still insisted on visiting me on difficult days. Because starting over isn't linear. It's a dance between falling and rising, between tears and small smiles that slowly emerge. But there's immense beauty in this phase, the beauty of finally listening to yourself, of respecting your own voice, of making decisions aligned with your own essence, and not with other people's expectations. And even with all this, there were days when I still wondered if I'd made the right choice. Until one morning, waking up in a new place, on a borrowed mattress, with almost nothing around, I realized something was different. The silence of that house no longer suffocated me. It embraced me. It was a light silence, a silence of new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, I felt my soul wasn't trapped. It was at peace. It hurts. It hurts in a way no one prepares you for. It's not just the pain of the end of a marriage, it's the pain of the end of a narrative you've sustained for so long. That story you told yourself to keep going, even when everything was already crumbling inside. It hurts to look in the mirror and realize you're no longer the same woman who swore, "Until death do us part." But it also hurts to realize how much you lost yourself trying to maintain a pact that, in practice, only consumed you. The end, however necessary, is always a mourning, a silent, invisible, and often lonely mourning. Because when you finally stop pretending, many people walk away. But there's something profoundly liberating about this abandonment. As if, little by little, the masks fall not only from others, but from ourselves as well. The curious thing is that, even with all this pain, there's a kind of relief that slowly begins to grow inside. A kind of respite you didn't even know you needed, but when it arrives, it changes everything. It's as if your entire body says, "Now yes, I can exist." And that's no exaggeration, because living trying to please, to disguise, to protect the image of a wounded marriage requires too much energy, an energy that begins to be lacking for everything, to take care of yourself, to dream, to pray sincerely. And the cruelest thing is that, in this process, we even distance ourselves from God, not because He left us, but because we began to believe He would only accept us within that suffering, as if pain were an offering of holiness, as if silent resignation were nobler than the courage to step out and live truthfully. But it isn't. And I discovered this the day I sat alone in my new space, wept silently, and, for the first time in a long time, felt God there. Not the God I used to justify my stay, but the God who knows me beyond appearances, the God who saw me pretending to be okay when my heart screamed, the God who heard me in the prayers I didn't even have the strength to voice, the God who knew me deep down and still loved me. I felt He saw me, not as so-and-so's ex-wife, not as the woman who gave up on her marriage, but as a daughter, and in that moment, it was like breathing again. It's strange, because the pain didn't disappear, but it changed form. Before, it was a pain that suffocated. Now, it was a pain that cleansed, a pain that taught, a pain that revealed, a pain that said, "This is also part of your new beginning." And I began to understand that this process wasn't just an end, it was a crossing, an internal journey of rediscovery, a path where I no longer needed to pretend, nor constantly justify myself, nor carry a weight that wasn't just mine. It was enough to be honest, with myself, with God, and with my own story. Still, the separation exposed me to looks that spoke more than words, people who greeted me with a lopsided smile, as if trying to guess the underlying reason for my decision. Others who offered unsolicited advice, as if my heart were a theological problem to be solved. But over time, I learned to filter, to not absorb judgments that weren't accompanied by empathy, to not accept blame that wasn't mine, and above all, to appreciate the few, but precious, who looked at me with warmth and said, "You're alive, and that matters." Because ultimately, leaving that place wasn't just about closing a cycle. It was about reconnecting with who I am, with the woman who dreams, who feels, who desires a life of purpose and truth. And this reconnection, challenging as it was, brought me a freedom no religious script could offer. The freedom to exist whole, without disguises, without imposed roles, without needing to fit into an unwelcoming mold. This freedom, yes, came with pain, but also with revelations, with discoveries, with a new mindset. And each day, even the hardest, began to carry the seed of something new, as if God were silently saying to me, "Now that you've chosen yourself, I can show you what I truly have in store for you." And it was in this space between what hurt and what was revealed that something even more profound began to happen. And it was in that space between what hurt and what was revealed that something even deeper began to happen, an internal realignment, a slow but true rebuilding of my roots. Because when we stop trying to fit into what others expect, there's room to discover who we truly are, without filters, without fear, without the constant need to please. It was there, in the quietest days, that I began to feel life calling me again, not euphorically, but firmly, as if, with each small step, I told myself, "You're not going back to square one, you're moving toward your truth." And it's on this truth that this channel stands. It wasn't created to give you ready-made answers, but to open paths of reflection, acceptance, and courage. Because I truly believe that when we share stories with sincerity, something powerful happens, not only within the speaker, but also within the listener. So, if this content touches you in any way, if these conversations resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe here. not as just another number, but as part of a space where vulnerability is strength, and everyone's journey matters. Your presence here makes a difference. Your participation is what keeps this space alive, pulsating, reaching others who may be exactly where you once were. People who need to hear that they're not alone, that starting over is possible, and that there's beauty even in the most difficult processes. So, if you feel this is a place where your soul breathes more lightly, come walk with us, because little by little, everything falls into place, and even what seemed like the end begins to reveal the seeds of something that will yet blossom. Some turned their faces away. Others began to look at me as if I'd done something unforgivable, as if my decision to leave, after years of trying, crying in silence, carrying burdens no one saw, was in itself an act of rebellion against everything that was right. I heard harsh words, some from people I never would have imagined. You destroyed your home. Woman of God, you can handle it. Just pray more. And as much as part of me still wanted to explain, justify, calm things down, there came a time when I realized they weren't supposed to understand. I was supposed to obey. This was one of the hardest revelations of my journey. Obedience to God won't always look good in the eyes of others. Sometimes it will feel like disobedience to the system, the culture, and social expectations. It will feel like a rupture. It will hurt those who have grown accustomed to seeing you downcast and silent. But deep down, it's not about being accepted. It's about being free. It's about having the courage to listen to the right voice amidst so many voices. And it's curious how, in this process, faith takes on new forms. Before, my faith was very much based on persevering. I believed that faith was about enduring, resisting, staying even when my heart was broken. But in this new era, I discovered that faith is also about movement. It's about traversing the unknown. It's about trusting without a map. It's about saying yes to God even when everything around you screams, "Stay where you are." Faith that grows in pain has deeper roots, because it isn't nourished by appearances, but by surrender. There were days when I cried not because of longing, but because of the feeling of being alone in the world, as if everyone had followed a script, and I was the only one who tore the pages halfway through. But in those moments, something reminded me. God doesn't need human applause to validate what He does. He doesn't measure our faithfulness by what others say, but by the intention of our hearts. And at that time, that was all I had inside me. The intention to start over with truth, to build a new mindset, to stop pretending. Real transformation begins like this, in the confrontation between what others expect of you and what God calls you to live. And it is in this silent backstage where almost no one sees that grace reveals itself most powerfully. Little by little, I stopped trying to control what people said about me. I no longer had the energy to try to please those who only saw my story superficially. And even in the moments when loneliness gripped me, a strange, but present, peace accompanied me. It was as if God were saying, "I see you. I know what's behind the scenes, and that's what matters." This peace wasn't an absence of conflict. It was the presence of a new certainty, a certainty that didn't come from logic, but from faith. Because when we decide to obey, even in the face of judgment, a strength begins to well up from within. A strength that doesn't come from within us, but that sustains us, that carries us forward, that changes the way we walk, even without changing the path itself. And it was like this, amidst rocks and promises, that something much greater began to reveal itself. And it was precisely there, in that place of silence, where many thought my faith would fade, that I found the truest flame. Not the kind of faith that makes noise or needs to constantly prove something, but a faith that sustains itself within, even when everything around it seems to be crumbling. And the most beautiful thing is that, in this process, I rediscovered God, not as a harsh judge, not as a rigid boss ready to demand spiritual goals I could never achieve, but as a father, a real father, who doesn't place conditions on his love, who didn't demand a plan of correction to be able to accept me again, who didn't come with a report of everything I did or didn't do. He simply welcomed me. And that, for me, was more transformative than any visible miracle, because it was in this acceptance that the guilt began to lose its power. The shame, that had previously held me back began to give way to a new understanding of identity. God didn't want a perfect servant. He wanted a present daughter. For a long time, I had confused service with intimacy. I thought that if I did everything right, he would be satisfied. But it was in that valley, in that off-script detour, that I realized he didn't just want my performance. He wanted my heart, and that changes everything. Because when we see God as our boss, we live in fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of not being able to cope, fear of disappointing him. But when we rediscover him as our Father, a new lightness comes. A freedom that isn't irresponsible, but mature. It's the kind of freedom born of trust, not of pressure. And it's funny how this distorted view of God slowly forms, silently, like a fog. We don't even notice. We listen to speeches about worthiness, listen to advice with good intentions but fragile theology. We try to fit into a mold of spirituality that sickens more than it heals. Until one day, when everything falls apart, when titles no longer hold anything, when reputation loses its former value, we find ourselves face to face with him. He has always been the Father who called us closer. It was with this new understanding that my faith began to breathe again. I no longer prayed to test my faith, but to converse. I no longer read the Bible with guilt, but with hunger. I no longer went to his presence as someone punching a time clock, but as someone finding a home. And this was so liberating that, for the first time, I understood what grace is. Not the distorted grace used as an excuse to escape principles, nor the punitive version that only places a burden on our shoulders, but real grace, the kind that constrains, that heals, that transforms from the inside out, that doesn't demand perfection, only surrender. And it wasn't a theatrical surrender, you know? It was a simple surrender, raw, full of scars, but honest. I stopped trying to appear strong before him. I began to fearlessly present my flaws, the unanswered questions, the pain no one knew about. And in that place, I realized that spiritual authority isn't about who has the most control, the most power, the most appearance of holiness. It's about who has the courage to remain surrendered, to trust even when they don't understand, to remain with their heart exposed, knowing that there, in vulnerability, God works more profoundly. This hidden truth, that God wants us to be surrendered, not flawless, was what turned the tide for me, because it freed me from the cycle of trying to be good enough. And when we break out of this cycle, we discover something precious. Our strength lies not in our constancy, but in his faithfulness. I began to experience a lighter, more alive, more authentic faith, one that didn't depend on external approval or internal perfection, only on presence. And it was in this presence that my heart began to align itself again, not because everything around me changed, but because I changed within. And this silent transformation, away from the spotlight, was what most impacted my journey, because it was there, without needing to prove anything to anyone, that I realized true spiritual authority arises when you stop representing something before God and begin to live something with him. It's not about power. It's about surrender, about walking with the certainty that you are loved not for what you do, but for who you belong to. And in this belonging, there is a new beginning that no one can stop. And it was in this fertile ground of surrender, where everything seemed lost, that reconstruction began. It wasn't quick nor romantic. It was slow every day, almost imperceptible at first. Like someone who, after a storm, finds the scattered pieces of their own history and calmly decides to glue everything back together. But this time, consciously, not in a rush. In my early 60s, I began to see myself differently. The image that had previously made me uncomfortable in the mirror gradually took on a dignified appearance, not because the marks disappeared, but because I learned to see them as scars of survival, not as flaws. Taking on this reconstruction was a decision, and every true decision is born from a change in mindset. I was no longer trying to make up for lost time. I was determined to live, deeply, the time I had left. And that changes everything. Because from the moment you stop seeking validation and start seeking meaning, the surrounding environment no longer defines your steps. What moves you becomes what you carry inside, not what others expect from the outside. That's how I went back to studying. I picked up books that inspired me, immersed myself in topics that challenged me, allowed myself to learn as if I were 20 again, but now with the kind of maturity that only time owns. And this learning wasn't just for me. The more I rediscovered myself, the more I felt the urge to share. I began to counsel other women, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has walked through dark places and knows the way back. I didn't offer ready-made formulas. I offered presence, listening, truth, and to my surprise, this began to make an impact. Because when a broken woman rises, she carries an authority that comes not from titles, but from history, an authority that doesn't shout, but transforms, that doesn't impose, but inspires. Every conversation, every shared tear, every silent prayer showed me that rebuilding my identity wasn't just about me. It was about so many others who, like me, were trying to understand who they were after a breakdown. And that's when I realized a hidden truth no one told me. Identity isn't something fixed, immutable. It rebuilds itself throughout the journey. It adapts, matures, strengthens behind the scenes. And that's okay. What doesn't change is the essence. That remains. But the way we see ourselves, how we position ourselves, how we react to pain and new beginnings that can and should be transformed. Today, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see a woman trying to disguise the traces of the past. I see someone whole, even if marked, and it is precisely in these marks that power lies, because they remind me of what I overcame, what I learned, what I needed to leave behind. They are living proof that it is possible to start over after an abyss, and not just start over, it is possible to flourish. I didn't need to erase my history, I simply needed to resignify it. I understood that identity is not built based on other people's expectations, but on the revelations that life brings us day after day when we have the courage to face our truth head-on. This reconstruction also taught me something profound about value. For a long time, I associated my worth with my performance, my usefulness, how admired or desired I was. But as I walked back to myself, I realized that true value lies not in how much we do, but in how much we are. And being, simply being, with authenticity, with vulnerability, with courage, is one of the most powerful things we can offer the world. It freed me from comparison, from rushing, from the fear of not being enough, because I already am, and always have been. You just had to remember. In my early 60s, amidst a scenario many would call the end of the line, I allowed myself to begin again. Not as someone trying to erase what was, but as someone honoring each step and moving forward, with purpose. Today, each new morning feels like an opportunity, not to fix the past, but to create new meanings. Because deep down, that's what grace does to us. It doesn't turn back time, but transforms the present so profoundly that even the past begins to be seen with new eyes. And this clarity changes everything. It restores our freedom to be whole, even after we've been broken. And if there's one thing I'd like to say to younger women, and I say this not as someone who teaches, but as someone who wants others to avoid carrying unnecessary burdens, it's, please don't accept a faith that silences you. Don't confuse obedience with self-denial. Don't confuse reverence with fear. And above all, don't confuse submission with voicelessness. There's a stark difference between being led by the Spirit and being controlled by systems that use God's name to impose guilt and erase identities. It took me a while to understand this, and perhaps the greatest gift this journey has given me is precisely this clarity. God didn't create me to be a repository of pain, but a living witness to restoration. And that changes absolutely everything. For many years, I swallowed my words, hid my anguish, and wore polite smiles, thinking this was part of my calling, as if suffering in silence were proof of spirituality, as if enduring everything in the name of faith were a virtue. But do you know what I discovered? That God is not impressed by masks. He doesn't expect religious performance from us, but true surrender. He doesn't want us to remain silent in the face of injustice. He wants us to stand up with truth, even if our voices tremble. Because when you're a daughter, you don't need to hide. You can speak, you can ask, you can even scream if necessary. He can handle it. And what's more, he responds, not with condemnation, but with presence. It's important to say this because there's a hidden truth that isn't often mentioned. Much pain in women's lives arises precisely from distorted interpretations of faith, from leaders who demand sacrifice but lack compassion, from speeches that mold behavior but ignore the heart, from environments that demand perfection but stifle humanity. And this is when many women begin to believe that feeling is wrong, that questioning is rebellion, that having limits is a lack of spirituality. But this doesn't come from God. It comes from a structure that fears awakened, whole women, aware of their identity. If I could show you the behind the scenes of my journey, you would see how many times I've suppressed my tears in the name of order, how many times I've accepted emotional abuse because I was told forgiveness was immediate and unprocedural, how many times I've overruled my own spiritual discernment because someone in authority told me I should obey without thinking, but grace opened my eyes. And from the moment I understood that the Holy Spirit speaks to me personally, everything changed. Because when you truly hear His voice, you no longer allow yourself to be silenced by fear. You even continue with respect, with humility, but now with discernment, with firmness, with the awareness that you were created with value, not guilt. And this is something no one tells you right away. Maturity in faith doesn't make you more passive. It makes you more active, more sensitive to the pain of others, yes, but also more aware of your own limits. Spiritual maturity doesn't distance you from reality. It places you right in the center of it, but with a different mindset, with the courage to say, this isn't right, with the boldness to confront what hurts, with the wisdom not to confuse God's voice with the cry of human rules. True faith doesn't require you to fade away. It invites you to flourish, and flourishing often means breaking the silence. So, if you are a younger woman, now living the first chapters of your faith journey, I say to you with all the love in the world, protect your sensitivity, honor your intuition, cultivate your communion with God as something intimate, true, and alive. And please, don't surrender your voice in exchange for acceptance, because God doesn't need you to be silent to love you. On the contrary, He loves you when you take a stand with truth, when you embrace what you feel, when you don't adapt to what makes you sick. Being a woman of faith isn't synonymous with becoming invisible. It's becoming aware of the impact your existence has. And you can only experience this when you truly understand who called you. Don't accept any gospel that puts you in a cage. The gospel of Jesus liberates, heals, restores, calls you by name. He doesn't say, be quiet. He says, rise. He doesn't say, swallow your tears. He says, come to me, you who are weary. This is the God I've rediscovered. And when you discover this love without demands for performance, you understand. You don't need to fit a mold. You need to be transformed from the inside out, with truth. And this transformation doesn't nullify your story. It redefines everything you've experienced so far, prepares you for more conscious decisions, and sets you on a path where your journey becomes testimony, where even what seemed like loss becomes revelation, where even what seemed like silence was actually God teaching you to listen better. Today, when I read that verse, the wise woman builds her house, it no longer weighs on me like an obligation, but pulses like an invitation. Before, I read this phrase as a burden disguised as virtue. It seemed that this wisdom expected of a woman was silent, submissive, always smiling, and ready to put out emotional fires that weren't even hers, as if the house were a physical place she needed to keep impeccable, even if inside it was crumbling. But the years and the pain have taught me to look more deeply. Today, I understand that this house is not just a home with walls and a roof. It is the heart. It is the inner space where everything begins. And this space needs to be whole, healed, realigned with God's truth. The turning point in my journey came when I realized I was trying to build the wrong house. I was trying to hold together my family, marriage, image, ministry, reputation, all with my own hands, while my heart was in tatters. I did this thinking I was being faithful. But how can someone build what's outside if it's destroyed inside? How can a home be sustained with wisdom if the soul is confused, wounded, and voiceless? The revelation that struck me was this: The heart is the foundation. The house a wise woman builds begins within herself. It's not selfishness, it's structure, because no one gives what they don't have. And the woman whose heart is in God builds not through effort, but through presence. She doesn't need to prove herself, she simply lives, and that, in itself, transforms everything around her. This shift in mindset is liberating, because it takes you out of the religious rut and puts you on the path of truth. Suddenly, you understand that wisdom isn't about knowing what to do all the time, but about knowing who to entrust everything to. That building isn't about controlling, it's about trusting. That keeping a house standing isn't about ignoring the chaos. It's about recognizing the cracks and allowing grace to enter through them. And this changes the way you look at your own story. Mistakes are no longer sentences, they are lessons learned. Losses don't define you, but reveal the strength you retain. Scars are no longer ugly, they are survival maps. Many people think wisdom is about having quick answers, but in practice, it shows itself in silent decisions, in the way you deal with what you can't change, in the courage to do things differently, even without guarantees. It's when you choose the truth, even knowing it can be misinterpreted, when you retreat to pray instead of reacting, when you assert yourself without hurting, when you say no, knowing you'll disappoint someone, but needing to honor your own soul. This too is edifying. This too is wisdom. And it only arises when your heart is aligned with God, not with the fear of displeasing others, but with the genuine desire to live in peace with Him and with yourself. Today, I see the impact of this transformation even in the details of my daily life, in the conversations I have, in the way I pray, in the way I welcome other women. Before, I spoke of God based on memorized verses. Today, I speak based on lived encounters. Before, I tried to convince. Today, I simply share. Because when the heart is whole, words don't come as impositions. They come as truth. And those who hear them feel them. Not because they come from me, but because they have passed through me. And that's why, over time, wisdom has also taken on a new face for me. It no longer has that austere air of someone who knows everything. It's simple, almost invisible, but profoundly impactful. It's in the silence that listens, in the embrace that sustains, in the prayer no one sees. It's in the choice to continue loving even after being hurt. It's in the decision not to become bitter, even with every reason. It's in looking back without denial, but also without imprisonment. Because a wise woman doesn't ignore what she's experienced. She honors it, she acknowledges it, and from there, she builds, not as if rebuilding everything from scratch, but as if using even the rubble to shape something new. The most surprising thing is that this internal change inevitably ends up being reflected externally. Without you forcing it, the people around you begin to notice. They realize you no longer react the same way, that there's a firmness in your voice, that your gaze holds a kind of peace that can't be bought. This doesn't come from courses or manuals. It comes from within. It comes from a heart that has been healed, restored, repositioned in God. And that's where the verse takes flesh, becomes life. The wise woman builds, yes, but she can only build what's external because she's learned to care for what's internal. And it is in this blossoming that true legacy is born. Not the one built with titles, accolades, or appearances, but the one that remains when all that no longer matters. I am Margaret Thompson. I am 75 years old. I have survived abandonment, judgment, and pain that seemed endless. I have tried to hide the cracks. I have forced myself to wear a strength that wasn't mine. I have believed that being a woman of faith meant swallowing my tears and keeping smiling. But today I know there is no healing without truth. There is no freedom without exposure. And there is no restoration without courage. Therefore, if I could leave only one mark on this journey, it would be this. You don't have to die trying to appear strong. You can live being true. You can, yes, say you're tired. You can confess you need help. You can look at yourself with compassion and recognize that, even wounded, there is still life within.